So let me start first by thanking you for being here today. I'm here with my co-host. I'm in London. I'm here with my co-host Vincent Lima in Rochester, New York, and we're obviously joined with Charlie Laderman, Professor Charlie Laderman in London, but also Vicken Cheterian in Geneva, and former Ambassador John Evans, U.S. Ambassador Armenia John Evans, who is now in Washington, D.C. The format is that Charlie is going to give about a 20-minute presentation, and then we will open it up to debate on some of the themes that he touches on. So most of it, hopefully, will be a discussion, and then we'll maybe John can end it with some commentary on as appropriate. Some information to the participants. Charlie is at King's College London. His book Sharing the Burden, The Armenian Question, Humanitarian Intervention, Anglo-American Visions, just came out from last year by Oxford University Press. He's also written in journals and newspapers some on the Armenian theme of the past 6 months, 6 to 8 months. Vicken is a professor it's a lecturer at International History and International Relations at the University of Geneva and Webster University in Geneva. He's the author of many books related to Armenians, the last one being Open Wounds, Armenians, Turks, and the Century of Genocide from Hearst Publishers in 2015. Ambassador Evans, of course, his book, Truth Held Hostage, America and the Armenian Genocide, What Then, What Now, is a classic in its own right. So without any further ado, we'll let Charlie make his presentation, and we can take it on from there.
Well, thank you so much, Aaron. Thank you to Vincent, to John, and Vicken as well. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all, and thank you to the Gomidas Institute for hosting this event. We'd originally planned this talk for around a year ago, before the global pandemic upended things, and it seems a long time ago now, particularly as it was around that time that we were scheduled to speak, was when Congress voted overwhelmingly to recognise the Armenian Genocide. And there are a few issues that have brought any sort of bipartisan consensus in recent months in the US Congress. So this was one. With that in mind, what I intend to do today is to take up that challenge issued by Congress. Let me just start by sharing my screen. What I'm planning to do today, and what Congress, the challenge that they issued, was to encourage education and public understanding of the facts of the Armenian Genocide, including the American role in the humanitarian relief efforts and the relevance of the Armenian Genocide to modern day crimes against humanity. So specifically what I'm going to try and do today is try to explain why the struggle for survival of one of the world's smallest nations became so entangled in the foreign policy of the United States as it rose to world power. And in doing so, what I'm going to try and do, and towards the end of the talk I'll try and do in more detail, is explore the possibilities, limitations, and the continued dilemmas of humanitarian intervention today. And that's not to say that the debates that we're going to be talking about, the historic debates, are directly analogous to the ones that we face today, that the United States faces today. The past is indeed a foreign country, as L.P. Hartley said, and they did do things differently then. But American interests and security fears, even while not being exactly the same as those that it faces today, the statesmen who oversaw them did face some comparable dilemmas, and I want to discuss a few of them at the end of this talk. And I'd also be happy in the discussion to talk more about the British role, which is a major part of my book. But in the interest of time, and as Ara has given me a clear cut-off time, I will devote these opening comments just to the American story. So it was especially apt that it was Congress that took the lead in recognising the Armenian Genocide and signifying its importance to modern day crimes against humanity, because it was the case that 120 years ago that another congressional resolution regarding the Armenians signified a fundamental departure in US foreign policy, and it signalled that the US was becoming a world power with international responsibilities and was no longer going to remain aloof to events beyond its hemisphere. The earlier resolutions occurred in the wake of the first large-scale Armenian massacres, which ultimately claimed the lives of roughly 100,000 Armenians between 1894 and 1896, as I'm sure most of you will know, and served as a precursor to the even greater crimes of 1915. Initially, as previously throughout the 19th century, private charities and churches took the lead in marshalling the relief efforts. The leadership of that humanitarian movement was the American missionary lobby, which had been proselytizing in the Ottoman Empire for most of the 19th century and had built up a larger field than that of almost any other nation. On the other hand, the government declined to involve itself diplomatically in the crisis or to concern itself with addressing the causes initially. But as public outrage grew, petitions began pouring into Congress, appealing for American action. And aware that their nation was rapidly emerging as a leading industrial power with a major navy that was starting to expand, many Americans now urged their representatives to use this power to address the greatest humanitarian atrocity of the age. And in early 1896, Congress passed a resolution calling for President Grover Cleveland to stay the hand of fanaticism in the Ottoman Empire. And this was an unprecedented step. It was the first time a branch of the federal government had taken a stand and issued a political solution to a humanitarian problem occurring outside the Western Hemisphere. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that. You can find more about it in the book, as Ara mentioned. But ultimately, what happens in the aftermath of this is that congressional agitation doesn't lead to executive action beyond sending a couple of these new warships to the Eastern Mediterranean to protect the rights of American missionaries caught up in the cataclysm. But even though the response is quite limited at this point, it does show that there's a bold new humanitarian spirit infusing American diplomacy. And this is encapsulated by President Theodore Roosevelt, who, after assuming office in 1901, articulates a set of principles outlining America's responsibility to intervene in response to crimes against civilization. The 1894-6 Armenian Massacres and the failure of any power to prevent them profoundly impacts his thinking, and he frequently invokes Armenian suffering as a symbol of man's inhumanity and the clearest justification for righteous wars. Now, at this time, the Armenian question, as symbolized in this map, and this is a map that's imprinted on the mind of many Americans at this time because of the importance of the Armenian cause and the humanitarian relief lobby. And Roosevelt is one of those figures. And as I said, he references the Armenians when protesting a whole range of other humanitarian atrocities around the world, including anti-Jewish pogroms in Eastern Europe, and also in intervening diplomatically in the Congo against King Leopold's regime there. It's the Armenian issue that's a centerpiece for them, though. And although most Americans share Roosevelt's horror at these atrocities that go on, many disagree with his response. And in the case of the Democrats, and particularly the former Secretary of State Richard Olney, he says that this is really lecturing a foreign state upon the management of its internal affairs is not something that the United States should be doing. Roosevelt disagrees, and in his 1904 address to Congress, sets out to justify his conduct and to outline a set of principles that would govern humanitarian intervention. And he proclaims that Americans should prioritize, first of all, dealing with their own sins, most critically violent race prejudice, over protesting against wrongdoing elsewhere. But despite America's own very obvious shortcomings, Roosevelt says, he believes that it has a duty to censure international wrongdoing because it had on the whole shown a commitment to principles of civil and religious liberty and orderly freedom. And what's more, there were occasional crimes committed on so vast a scale and of such peculiar horror that ultimately action was justified. And while Roosevelt believed that there were only a few cases where intervention should occur by force of arms, it was inevitable that America should desire eagerly, as he said, to give expression to its horror when it witnesses such systematic and long extended cruelties as that which the Armenians have been the victims of and which have won for them the indignant pity of the civilized world. Now, this set of principles doesn't make much of an impression in the United States, but it certainly does abroad, where there's uproar about the possibility of American intervention in Europe. And this is symbolized by the French author Henry Hauser, who characterises this as humanitarian imperialism and warns Europeans that the governance of the world is no longer a matter for them alone. Now, Roosevelt's message raises hope among Armenians, among Russian Jews and their supporters that he would interfere more vigorously on their behalf. And after reports of renewed Armenian massacres in 1904, Roosevelt is urged to intervene. But this muted response to his message chills his ardour for action. He tells an advisor that while he was entirely satisfied to head a crusade for the Armenians, there is no chance that the Americans will back him up on this. He tried to rouse Americans to back up their words by deeds, but ultimately, while eager to protest abuses by other nations, Americans weren't willing to build up the instruments of power, the military and the navy, that Roosevelt saw as being essential to make these protests effective. So for the rest of his presidency, Roosevelt invokes a dictum that he had originally learnt as a cowboy in the American West: don't draw unless you mean to shoot. But even while pursuing this more limited and more cautious approach, Roosevelt remains convinced that America, if it had the opportunity, should intervene for the Armenians. And so when a few years later, in 1915, when amid the atrocities and the turmoil of the First World War, reports reached the United States of the Ottomans perpetrating new atrocities against the Armenians, the now former President Roosevelt is the most outspoken advocate of intervention. To his disgust, the US official response is restrained. Although the American public respond with an impassioned expression of public philanthropy, you can see a couple of the posters here, they contribute vast sums to one of the largest relief operations in American history. The official US response is not an active one. President Woodrow Wilson is more concerned with maintaining American neutrality in the First World War and wants to avoid public condemnation of one of Germany's principal allies. But even after entering the war in 1917 against Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Americans avoid declaring war on their Ottoman ally. Now, this approach disgusts Roosevelt. He says the Armenian massacre is the greatest crime of the war, and the failure to act against Turkey is to condone it. He believes that America is fighting in a common cause with Britain and France, and not declaring war on the Ottoman Empire is a show of bad faith towards America's allies. Above all, Roosevelt is adamant that if the US doesn't intervene for the Armenians, what it shows is, in his mind, that all talk of guaranteeing the future peace of the world is nothing but mischievous nonsense and insincere claptrap. Roosevelt's position reflects a consistent conviction, as we've seen, to act and to intervene when these atrocities occur. And what Roosevelt sees is this unwillingness to act when the atrocities against the Armenians are so evident. He says that this compromises any claims that America has to be the guardian of the highest civilized ideals. Now, Roosevelt is motivated by a rival internationalism and a rival humanitarianism to that of his great rival Woodrow Wilson. What Wilson believes is something quite different. He doesn't believe in a military solution, and certainly not during the war. The failure of the Allied assault on Gallipoli had already underlined the difficulties in invading the Ottoman Empire. What Wilson's prime concern was the defeat of Germany. And unlike Roosevelt, he didn't believe it was America's duty to vindicate the Armenians by declaring war on their oppressors. And the principal domestic community with interest in the Near East supports him. That's the American missionaries. While they're administering humanitarian aid to the Armenians, they're insistent that America refrain from declaring war. They're fearful that this preeminent position that they built up in the 19th century, that would be threatened by intervention in the war. And the missionary determination to remain on good terms with the Ottomans dovetails with Wilson's larger foreign policy ambitions. First, to stay out of the war, and then once in, to focus on the larger picture. The Ottoman Empire, in Wilson's mind, is only relevant as an ally to Germany. And they see it that once Germany is defeated, the threat to world peace would vanish and the Ottoman Empire would collapse. Now, it's not often appreciated that the US doesn't declare war on the Ottoman Empire, at least on a public level, or that the US is an associated power in the conflict rather than an ally. Now, why is that? Well, it's because Wilson, unlike Roosevelt, distrusts the Allies, and he doesn't want the US involved in an Allied war for control of the Middle East. And this is the principal reason for that decision. Yet his apparent inaction in the face of the massacres belies the outsized role that the Armenians come to play in his own vision of reforming global politics. At the end of the war, Wilson wants Americans to take the lead in establishing a reformed international system. And you can see that in the map here. The Ottoman Empire would be dismembered and the security of its subject peoples guaranteed. And in this new order, the United States, and this is a map from Wilson's own papers that I got in the Library of Congress, the United States would have a special role to play in Armenia. In addition to urging US membership of the new League of Nations he had outlined, Wilson hoped that it would help the surviving Armenians to establish their own state. And this American mandate for the Armenian state, this nascent Armenian Republic, he saw it as a manifestation of his new world order. But as opposition to the League concept grows, Wilson is forced to subordinate his commitment to Armenian security to winning Senate approval of the League and the Versailles Treaty. So for Wilson, this mandate is a symbol of American selflessness and moral leadership. But for his opponents, this is just evidence of the unrewarding and open-ended commitments that the League would impose on the United States. And ultimately, Wilson's growing commitment to the Armenian cause is met by increasing American hostility to international commitments of any kind. So for Republican leader Henry Cabot Lodge and the rest of Wilson's opponents, they say that the Americans are being burdened with the world's poorhouse, while its former associates in the war, Britain and France, seized more lucrative territories in the Middle East. Wilson's critics claim it's unconstitutional to tax Americans for altruistic service to other peoples, and they summon up George Washington's farewell address and the Monroe Doctrine, sort of classics of American foreign policy in the 19th century. This is evidence that America should preserve its policy of non-entanglement in the old world. But the most significant thing is that they fear that Wilson is using this as a backdoor to get into the League of Nations, and they're determined to resist this. And even though Wilson sends commissions to the Middle East, a number of commissions, including this one, led by the American Chief of Staff, General Harbord, it's ultimately the mandate is rejected. And for the Republican Senator Warren Harding, who succeeds Wilson as president in 1920, the Republican position is summed up in his words when he says, "I'm not insensible to the sufferings of the Armenians, but I'm thinking of America first. Safety as well as charity begins at home." And ultimately, Harding makes this a principal theme of his 1920 campaign, and Wilson's request for an Armenian mandate is a regular point of attack. Now, the debates in Congress reflect the debates in the country at large. Appeals to America's historic world role mingles with a desire to limit international responsibilities. And you can see this in some of these cartoons. These are British cartoons of the idea of the United States coming in to take on the mandate, which is what they want. But you can also see through these cartoons the nature of the domestic debate in the United States. So for opponents, as you can see here in the cartoon of John Ball giving Uncle Sam the sort of the very small Armenian mandate and pocketing all the more lucrative territories, what they see this as, and this is what the Republicans say, they say that there's no more striking illustration can be found of President Wilson's disregard for the lives of American boys or interests than his request for an Armenian mandate. And they say that there's a difference between humanitarian aid and the material and political control that America should avoid. On the other hand, you can see the other cartoon here of Congress crying crocodile tears at the fate of the Armenians. And the New Republic sums up this position when it says, "If we fail at this juncture to vindicate the rights of the Armenians, then we shall never again persuade the world that our moral sentiments are anything but empty rhetoric." And this is just an instance of America sort of putting its own material interests over the rest of the world. So ultimately, this encapsulates a debate that occurs over the very character of the American nation. Ultimately, Wilson is unable to convince Americans to join the League, and his request to assume a mandate was also rejected. Correspondingly, deprived of protection, Armenian independence is short-lived, crushed between Bolshevik expansion and Turkish nationalism. Now, although the United States is unable to prevent the wartime atrocities or to secure Armenia's independence, this shouldn't detract from its importance during this critical period in American history. As American power expands at the turn of the 20th century, so does the sense that the nation could use its strength to aid oppressed minorities, such as the Armenians. Events that would have been lamentable but unresolvable earlier in the 19th century occurring in regions beyond American reach, now provoke intense debate over whether the US should respond, and if so, how. Ultimately, American concern doesn't lead to a political commitment. But in attempting to convince their fellow countrymen of their responsibility to the Armenians, both Roosevelt and Wilson extend the parameters of the debate on the purpose of American power and the nature of the American national interest. And as I say, this encapsulates the internal conflict over its world role. And the debate also demonstrates 5 dilemmas that would continue to bedevil American policymakers in the decades to come. Firstly, there's the problem of ensuring that presidential rhetoric doesn't become too detached from political realities. This is demonstrated, as I mentioned previously, most clearly in Roosevelt's dictum, "Never draw unless you need to shoot." Yet even while pursuing this cautious approach, Roosevelt remains convinced that if the opportunity arises, then the US should intervene for the Armenians. And so this illustrates a second and competing dilemma of how far a nation and a leader should go to reconcile his personal ideals with the public's conception of the nation's interests. Now, during his presidency, Roosevelt publicly promotes the Armenian cause as far as he feels is possible, but ultimately has to recognize that most Americans don't see this as being compatible with US interests. Wilson faces this predicament even more acutely in his attempts to secure a mandate. His opponents point to it as evidence that Wilson's internationalism is utterly divorced from any conception of the national interest. And so this backlash that we see against Wilson's idealism and his reluctance to assume broader international commitments, this reflects a pattern that we would see again and again throughout the 20th century and right up to the present day, when there seems to be a sense that policy is guided by excessive utopian thinking. But in responding to the Armenian crisis, Wilson is forced to wrestle with a third dilemma that any intervener in the face of a humanitarian atrocity faces. Either you assume the burden of administering the territory, or you force the oppressor to mend his ways. Moreover, having decided that the US should assume that burden, Wilson faces a fourth related dilemma over the legitimate basis for an intervention. Does it require the mandate of an international organisation like the League of Nations or the United Nations, as Wilson proposes, or should it be pursued unilaterally, either with a coalition of willing partners or on your own, as Roosevelt insists? But ultimately, all those who work to resolve the Armenian question for over 3 decades in the United States are confronted with the cruelest dilemma of all, that sometimes it's simply not possible to achieve a good solution. Now, Wilson himself makes sure he never forgets the Armenian tragedy. In November 1917, a delegation of Armenians had visited the White House and presented the president with a portrait of a young Armenian girl in traditional dress. The girl's haunted expression symbolises the destruction of her nation. In her hand, however, she clasps a mountain snowdrop, a flower that Armenians regard as a sign that winter is over and spring is on its way. The Armenians' faith that better days were ahead was captured by the painting's inscription, L'Espérance, hope. The portrait is displayed in the White House for the remainder of Wilson's term, and after leaving office, the former president brought the painting to his new home in Washington, D.C., where it continues to hang over the fireplace, as you can see in the drawing room to this very day, a constant reminder of the tragic question that neither he nor any other American was able to resolve. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlie. That's very succinct. It's the substance of much of your book and the basis of discussion. This whole idea of the Armenian question was not resolved is an interesting one, because it's still with us today. It hasn't gone away. And as we touched on it earlier, the recent congressional resolution has raised it once again. Now, what the context is, or what the potential results of that resolution might be, perhaps that could be a point of inquiry on our part, or a point of comment and discussion. Do you have any thoughts of that? Do you think it was just simply rhetorical, the way the resolution was passed, or do you think there's room there to reappraise the past, maybe raise the whole issue of the United States assuming a moral code in its foreign policy conduct? Are these really on the cards, or are we up for disappointment? What criteria would you use to begin to make sense or what's going on today, and whether the past with the Armenian question is still relevant with us today.
Yes, well, I think when the resolution passes, particularly initially in the House in November, the fact that it's tied into the American withdrawal of troops from the Syrian border, the persecution that's being experienced by Armenians and other Christians on the Syrian border at the hands of Islamic State, it was a very, very powerful historical echo that was coming back. From 100 years before, that many of these villages that had been cleansed in 1915, many civilians facing a very similar predicament today. And I think that did have a powerful impact on many, particularly in the House. Now, obviously, initially, the Turkish government mobilized and the Senate didn't pass a resolution. It was blocked in the Senate. I think the overcoming of that blocking as it came in December was an important step for Congress to do this jointly by both houses. Was a big departure. It's so difficult to know what the legacy and the consequences of it will be. I mean, Joe Biden has mentioned, as you know, recently, that he would recognise the Armenian genocide, but that follows in the footsteps of every US president since Ronald Reagan, at least, of saying they will recognise the genocide, but whether they actually will, once they get into office, we see something slightly different. I think it's all going to be tied into to the sense of Turkey and its place within sort of geopolitical calculations in the United States. You were mentioning the sort of the moral element, and yes, that's going to play a part for certain large segments of the American population, but it is something where the geopolitical calculations of the person in the Oval Office tends to override that. But I think those geopolitical calculations are shifting. I mean, when we're seeing what's going on in the Eastern Mediterranean at the moment, Turkey's position as a potentially reliable ally is very much being called into question. And I think we might see something again where the geopolitical and the moral and the historical start to stack up. But I'm sure others on the panel have even more to offer on this.
Ara, might I put in a comment at this point?
Go ahead. Thank you, John.
A couple things to remember. First of all, I don't disagree with anything that Charlie just said. But I would note that the House has more than once passed resolutions that in effect recognize the Armenian genocide. It's the Senate that has not. The other thing to keep in mind is that these are non-binding resolutions. They just express the sense of the particular House as to what the history is. And the other thing I would point out is that in this particular case, there was a conjunction of circumstances involving Turkey. First of all, the problems in Syria, as Charlie mentioned. Also, the intention of Turkey to purchase the Russian ground-to-air S-400 system. And then there were problems also over the new American fighter. So there was a lot of discontent with Turkey, and unfortunately or fortunately, we've noticed in the past that when people are annoyed with Turkey, these resolutions get more traction. The other thing is that a couple of times the White House did arrange for a senator to block the vote, which was, by the way, was up or down. There was no discussion. And one day there was simply no one who got up and blocked it. And it could have been simply bad work on Capitol Hill. So, and again, this is non-binding. It does not change the policy of the executive branch. And there were signals sent after it happened that the policy had not changed. So it's quite welcome but I don't think we should overestimate the importance of this bicameral vote.
But it's interesting that the resolution does talk about education, I mean, in an active sense of pushing the Armenian issue within the public sphere. I mean, isn't that couldn't that be a major step, whereas something that is in the background of people's minds can be more and more prominent with federal funding? Is this something that lobbyists might jump on, for example, to?
Yes, I think it was. I think it was very astute for those who designed these resolutions to get that in there. For one thing, it suggests that there might be some education of American diplomats as they come up through the ranks about the whole question of genocide. And I think it will be seized upon precisely for that purpose.
So Charlie, you might be talking to groups of American diplomats sometime soon on these issues, if it's more and more, relevant, shall we say. It's fantastic. This is where scholarship comes in, and truth matters. So
yes, it's something which, as the ambassador mentions, we shouldn't overstate the significance of it. But I suppose as we've been mentioning, the educational element does play a role, and getting the history right does play a role in terms of how we respond to upcoming atrocities, and to I mean, right. Samantha Power's book had a major impact in terms of the public space, in terms of ideas about intervention, and the fact that she starts with the Armenian genocide, and people like Gary J. Bass at Princeton, his book on humanitarian intervention, ending with the Armenians as well. This does play a role in terms of how people conceive of how you respond to atrocities, which is why I think we need to get the history right. I think one of the things that sort of struck me in something, Power's book, and it's a book I admire, but that sense to which the United States was just indifferent during the First World War is just, that's not the way in which it is something which are dilemmas facing policymakers, and these are real challenges to deal with the history, if we get the history right, we can get the policy better. That's my hope as well.
Charlie, if I may also say that you've done a great service here to provide so much context for this. So many books about the Armenian genocide start on April 24th, 1915, with no mention even of the Hamidian episodes, but you have gone back to 1896 to
I think we lost you, John.
Kind of stereoscopic way, which is remarkable. That is, with your knowledge of British cabinets and how the thinking changed between various ministers and prime ministers, and then also over several presidential terms, so that you've really given a wonderful context. I learned a lot from it. I don't know the British history as well as the American, but I found that being able to see them both at once, as in a kind of a stereoscope, was extremely helpful.
Thank you very much for your kind words. I think that, as you said, that is something that's really important within our understanding of the history. Is the British role is so significant, and it's fascinating to watch the way in which British policy changes over the course of this period as well. And obviously it's something which in Britain, I think for much of the 20th century and going into the 21st century, Britain is so critical to American debates over intervention as well. So I think that role, I think, is very important. Yes, sorry.
Well, and bringing it right up to the present, let's consider the fact that the UK and the United States are the two big powers that do not officially recognize the genocide. Yes. Now, it has to do with Turkey's membership of NATO, of course, but the UK and the US are still more or less locked together on this position.
Yes.
If I may interject there, it's interesting because what's happening in the United States, back to the resolution once more, really clashes now with the British scene, because the British Foreign Office's position is that the evidence on the Armenian genocide is not equivocal. It's not unequivocal, to use the term genocide. So this is where the congressional resolution gives some weight to lobbyists here, those who want to push a lobbyist angle. And I think that will ruffle some feathers within the Foreign Office. How far one pushes that issue is something else. The lobbying arm of the Armenians or any other group here is relatively weak right now, but it's something that will be a reference in the future. I mean, there has been movement in the United States that is substantial, even if it's not the executive of the American government, but it is important that Congress has taken such a bold step that our own parliament hasn't done so, despite the record of, including the publication of the Blue Book. The British articulated genocide thesis, yet our own foreign office is unabashed in its denial, or abetting denial in the United Kingdom. So, I mean, I think there's a cumulative aspect here where scholarship is mounting up, and it's also embarrassing for scholars who choose not to deal with the Armenian issue, people who deliberately leave the Armenian genocide in even the university courses or books as a footnote or something to be avoided. It's becoming more and more mainstream, and there is movement. I think there is a process here. I think maybe Vicken might say something about that. I mean, you've spoken up on it, that we are sidelined and we push to the sides. Yet but now we're getting more and more, mainstream debates and mainstream scholars, and very good ones at that, in the last 10 years, adding weight into this cumulative process, and the Armenian genocide or the Armenian question is becoming more and more an object of serious debate and discussion. And who knows what will happen in the Middle East. Turkey is now questioning the status quo in the Eastern Mediterranean. They're questioning sovereignty of Greek islands and so on and so forth. I mean, things that would have been far-fetched are being questioned, and it's looking possible. And the Syrian Kurds, they have American and Russian backing. I mean, there is a lot more going on than we might actually think at first. And it's worrying, obviously, but it's happening.
Well, and I think, as you say, the way in which the government in Turkey is drawing on history for its own rhetoric. I mean, Recep Erdogan's speech the other week towards Greece, and mentioning the what occurs to the Greeks in Anatolia. History is very much live again, and I think, Vicken will probably speak about this more, but everyone on this panel has done such great work in terms of helping to sort of excavate this historical record. And I think the more and more that politicians are drawing on sort of their interpretations of history, more and more the responsibility falls on scholars to say, well, this is where the historical record is being used and misused as well. And so, as you say, I think it's something. It's increasingly becoming an issue of major geopolitical concern of what's going on in the Middle East, and the echoes back to a previous era. It will become very, very difficult for people to teach the history of the present without drawing on this history of a century ago.
Right.
Absolutely. If I may, I think the dense history of the first 2 decades of the 20th century, which were for many long decades just ignored, censored, put aside, are extremely relevant today in what is going on in the Middle East. Turkey, but also think about communities like the Yazidis in Iraq, who faced genocidal violence from the side of Daesh, the Assyrians in this area. So I want to take our title, Humanitarian Intervention or Humanitarian Imperialism. And there we have tension between these two ideas. Is it humanitarian intervention or is it imperialism, something to reject and to fight against? This debate is very important, maybe not so much in London and Washington, DC, but in the Middle East itself. And this is a long debate. The Young Turks, Ahmed Riza and others, each time the Armenians or other Ottoman liberals ask for intervention from the side of Great Britain or other forces, liberal forces, European forces, they opposed in the name of being anti-imperialist. But when we look who is for intervention and who is against intervention, we see that populations that face the danger of massacres, of persecution, of repression, they are for intervention. And powers, empires, states, who want to have free hands to repress their own population, then they call any foreign intervention imperialist. And so there's a long tradition of this anti-imperialism, which is going on in the Middle East. And when we look, for example, the Kurds who were face to face with Daesh, they were in favor of US intervention to defend themselves from the mass violence of ISIS and company. The same with the minorities in Iraq, but also the same with the Syrian opposition. When the revolt started there in 2011, they were in favor of imperialist intervention. The same with the Libyan population. When they were facing the danger of massacres by Gaddafi's forces, they were in favor of imperialist so-called intervention. So we should, I think this is an important debate to take into consideration, especially today. We are commemorating 100 years after the Treaty of Sèvres, which is seen as something horrible, right? Sèvres was with Versailles. These were treaties which divided empires and caused so much harm in the Middle East. This is the popular point of view. Historically, it is not correct. Neither Versailles nor Sèvres were responsible for the division of the later on events in Europe, the emergence of German nationalism in Europe. It's not because of Versailles, nor Sèvres is the result of imperialism. It's the result of Ottoman Empire being defeated. But I want to take another tension between ideals, Charlie called it utopia, and politics. And this is the other tension we have to deal with. And in your book, you put it very, very, very well. In the conclusion, you say, you quote Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes, who says that there was a window of opportunity in early 1919 for a real intervention in favor of Armenians. And this is real politics. And we should also take into consideration that we are living in realpolitik world, that there are windows of opportunities that you can take or miss it. And once you missed it, it's gone. So while talking about values and humanitarianism, we should never forget that in the real world, there's real politics taking place.
I think that's a really excellent point, and I think I think what's really fascinating, as Vicken says, the importance of these political moments. But I think one of the things that's also really striking, and I think which comes out of this this as well, is the sense that I think we tend to think of this in the West as politics of choice, and we tend to think that after a period of intervention has happened, that, well, we then look after these interventions and say, well, we're never going to do that again. We look at sort of mistakes that were made, and then it sort of seems, particularly in a moment like now where there's so many international crises going on around the world, living through a global pandemic, that this is something which is gone, the idea of debates over intervention. But I think what we see again and again is these debates keep coming back. They're fundamental, and it's not just because, as Vicken says, it's not just the humanitarian side, but it's also because there are sort of realpolitik considerations here as well. And so these questions are not going away anytime soon, and the plight of persecuted minorities and people like the Yazidis in the Middle East, this is not something where we then say, well, these people now will be left to their fate. I think these debates will keep coming back, and that sense of a responsibility to intervene is going to be an ever-present debate in our politics.
Vincent.
I'm just thinking that you said the political moments come. The problem with the political moments is that they also pass. And Vicken was talking about how populations actually favor imperial, if you want to call it that, intervention. But once you rely on that imperial intervention, once the impetus for that intervention is passed, then suddenly the military force is gone and you're left to your own devices and you get massacred. And then the Congress passes a resolution about a different genocide from 100 years ago, which does you no good in real time. So I'm wondering about how important the impetus for action is. Is the impetus, if the impetus is moral indignation or, you know, sort of time-bound outrage at Turkey not bowing its head before American hegemony at a given time. And so now today we're going to pass this resolution. Tomorrow we'll do whatever we want to do. If the impetus doesn't come from the right place, or from the place we want it to come from, is the value of whatever action is taken still the same? Do we just take what we can get?
May I jump in here and make one point, and that is that some of the impetus for this comes from international law. One of the important things about 1915 was that for the first time, the concept of crimes against humanity was voiced in the note given by the Allies to the Ottomans in late May of 1915. And of course, international law has progressed since that time. Now, the big case of failure to intervene that happened since those days was the failure to intervene on behalf of European Jewry during World War II. And of course, the United States made the same decision that is Roosevelt made, FDR made the same decision that Wilson did, that was that you have to defeat Germany. And then you deal with the atrocities that have taken place. But after World War II, the United Nations formally decided that crimes against humanity are violations of international law. And of course, by that time, we had the Genocide Convention of 1948. So these things are considered to be punishable under international law. And there is an obligation on states both to try to prevent these things from happening and also to punish the perpetrators.
No, I think that is a really powerful impetus for intervention, which obviously it doesn't exist of an earlier era. But I think what's very interesting about sort of the 19th century is the amount of interventions that do occur. And I think sort of under sort of the rubric of the Concert of Europe, you do get sort of a number of interventions, of course, not for the Armenians. I mean, even though the level of atrocity is much greater than anything that had been experienced earlier in the 19th century, but the international law elements are very much in their infancy then. People are using the language of humanitarian intervention. The concept of humanitarian intervention begins in an earlier period, but then there isn't sort of the infrastructure of international law that John mentioned is so critical to this later period. So we have seen the sort of an even greater strengthening of that of those institutions through the responsibility to protect doctrine as it has developed as being something where that is a justification for the United Nations to intervene. But there's an absence now through the Security Council of any sort of collective action when these things do occur. And I do think these things do go in waves into sort of we might be sort of experiencing a time where these debates over intervention are going to have a lull because of the amount of other challenges that statesmen and the politicians are facing. Perhaps an absence of statesmanship as well is a part of this. But I think that I see no reason why we will not again in future be talking about some of these same issues as being live issues of international politics. So I think it is striking that the debate has gone through Congress, the resolution has passed through Congress at an interesting time in international politics, and perhaps others can speak more to why it occurred at this time and what they think the legacy of this will be, and will it impact things with a different administration in Washington, a different incumbent of the White House, or is this something which is not really going to make a major difference until a whole range of other things have changed as well?
Charlie, you are absolutely right that these things, there is a kind of a pendulum effect, or you could say waves that alternate. And your point about the 19th century is absolutely correct also. I mean, if you think of the British intervention in the, or at least unofficial intervention in the Greek struggle for independence, and the Russians were involved in that also against the Ottomans. As for the responsibility to protect, you know that in 2005, it was voted in officially by the General Assembly of the United Nations that states have a responsibility to protect their citizens. And the Secretaries General during this intervening time have developed this with what they call the 3 pillars of the responsibility to protect. First, nations should undertake to protect their people. States should help each other in fulfilling this goal. And if the nations are failing at it, then there's a collective responsibility to act to set things right again. Now, a famous American lawyer once said, Clarence Darrow, once said that you not only have to have good laws, you have to have good people. Or that's a paraphrase, but you have to have good international norms, but you also have to have states with an intention to uphold those norms. And at the moment, on this side of the Atlantic, we don't have that.
If I may take the political side of the question, I mean, do we need to, is it positive to have interventions? Is it positive to have US reminding Turkey about the Armenian Genocide? You might remember that Hrant Dink was against this. I mean, Hrant said that it's better to have this debate within Turkey. Now, my answer would be, as long as US resolutions kind of stimulate debate within Turkey, then it's positive. If we take this question from a different perspective, when we ask Kurdish activists in Turkey or human rights activists in Turkey, lawyers who are in prison, in front, while you are facing this repressive state where justice is missing, do you favor for intervention? Then their answer will be, yes, we need international intervention. But eventually, our kind of take should be that we need this intervention because there's a legal, political, but also moral vacuum in the Middle East since at least a century, which has turned things upside down, where mass killers have become heroes and populations were victimized, massacred, stolen, persecuted, have become targets of denial and censorship. So we need to bring this debate back into the region, to Turkey, but also in the Middle East, because we are now living the consequences of not only past violence, but also the denial of this violence.
you make excellent points, and I know what Hrant Dink was thinking when he rejected the action of various legislatures on the question of the genocide. But because of Turkey's insistent denial of these facts, I think the discussion goes into foreign fora. One other point, I was very taken by Charlie's discussion of Teddy Roosevelt's mention of America's human rights failings, pointing out that we have this terrible situation of racial injustice in this country. And of course, that's breaking out all over right now in real time. And so this question of crimes against humanity is coming home to roost, in a sense, in the United States.
Well, on a related point, Hrant Dink and ethics and so forth, a discussion that Vincent and I had concerned how whether it matters the motivations of the people voting for some of these measures, or the right kind of measures for the wrong reasons. If Congress passes resolution for Turk bashing purposes, what should we do as academics? Should we actually, how should we relate to that? And it does matter because many of our Turkish colleagues are disturbed by that this is just a Turk bashing measure. Their instinct is to actually be opposing it, and it creates a dilemma for us as well. Well, how do we relate to that, or how do we make a distinction saying, yes, some of the people voting for this measure may have had negative reasons or less than ethical reasons for doing so, but the resolution itself is worthwhile and can still serve good purpose. I mean, this is a dilemma for me personally as well. Or are we aligning ourselves with American sort of imperial interests or negative interests just because it seems to, and allow ourselves, our issue, to be turned into an instrument of Turk bashing, and then probably, cast it aside when it doesn't serve that purpose anymore, or they lose interest. But these are also moral dilemmas that we're faced with as Armenian intellectuals, or British Armenian or American Armenian intellectuals, because we are American and British citizens at the same time, as well as part of the victim group as well. I don't know what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, I think a few years back, I would have said, no, we don't need, external pressure, because for some years, between 2005, 2007, until maybe 2016, the failed coup in Turkey, there was a window of opportunity open, and we could carry this debate inside Turkey. And now it's that window has been shut down again. So we are forced to take the debate, as Ambassador even said. We are forced to rely on external fora to go on debating these very important and fundamental issues.
Yeah.
Is it something where the pendulum will again swing on this as well? We look at, say, something like Taner Akşam's work and the new documents that he's uncovered on question. Would it be something where would allowing the primary sources to ultimately speak for themselves, and sort of almost trusting to almost the longue durée of history, that once this evidence is out in the public realm, the more and more that actually debate is stirred by the primary sources rather than the politics, that actually the interests of historical truth are best served by that? I don't know. I mean, I think that's an important debate, as Ara mentions.
Well, but first of all, a lot of these works are being translated into Turkish. I mean, the Pandora's box is open. They can't put the genie back into it within Turkey. So all this new scholarship that keeps coming out, including yours, Charlie, will be read, and it does matter. And when I talk with Turkish intellectuals, they say, yes, we want recognition, we want resolutions, we want the scholarship, because it does trickle into the Turkish mainstream. And of course, Erdogan is trying to put blocks on that, is trying to control the debate once more, whether it's on the internet or through publications. But there is a debate within Turkey, and there is a question mark that people raise vis-a-vis the Turkish states, whatever they say. So on a positive note, I think there is change in there, and all of these are stacking up for the good. So, and that makes our scholarship and the work that we do relevant. So we're not where we were 30 years ago on this issue. We are way ahead, and I think we should actually continue down this road. I think it's drop by drop, but it's getting weightier and weightier, and Turkey will have to change. And at least that's what Hrant Dink would have said. So the idea is to sway opinion within Turkey to good scholarship, through ethical conduct. This is what the whole question of not appearing on Turk bashing platforms matters, because in the final analysis, yes, it is a Turkish audience that we want to reach out to, and it's already happening. It's become a bit harder. It was much easier 15 years ago. It's become harder, but it's become harder partly because the Turkish state is losing its narrative. I mean, Erdogan is trying to close down the discussion, partly because he could see where it's leading, and we're not back to zero. We're still way ahead. It's just that progress is slightly slower now than it was when Erdogan first came to power. Any final thoughts? We are coming up to an hour. Charlie or John or anyone else, Vincent or Vicken. All right. If there isn't,
I just wanted to echo Ambassador Evans' vote of thanks to Charlie for the work overall, but especially for the sort of pre-1915 perspective that he brought to bear. I was going to say that earlier, but it's a good closing thing to say too. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure to speak with you and to have such a wonderful panel put together, and people who've contributed so much to these debates. So it's a real pleasure to be welcomed into this community.
Great, thank you, Charlie, and thank you all the panelists. And we'll obviously we'll continue from here in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ara.